Hello, 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 and welcome. My name is Merle McGee, and I am the steward of Everyday Democracy, serving as president and CEO. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Doing Democracy. Why deliberate in a time of democratic crisis? Indeed, a good question to ask. Today's event, as you know, is part of an ongoing Doing Democracy series where we explore how we build inclusive, participatory communities from the grassroots. For more than 35 years, Everyday Democracy has brought people together for brave, inclusive dialogues and collective problem solving. We believe that democracy depends on everyday people and everyday actions. It's something we practice daily in our schools, our neighborhoods, and communities. And across the country, we're seeing democratic institutions and norms under attack. The growing acceptance of political violence and communities growing both more divided and aligned in the futures that they want to see. At the same time, many people are asking hard questions about how or whether the inclusive approaches to governance and the attitudes towards government we've championed, like dialogue, deliberation, shared decision-making, can meet this moment. So today, we thought we'd have that conversation to honestly explore what role tools of civic practice can play within democracy itself when it's under pressure. Today, we'll grapple with those curiosities together. And so, I am excited to welcome our panelists to this conversation. We're joined by Roshan Bliss, founder of Bliss Collaborations and the director of Democracy Innovations for the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. Roshan partners with nonprofits, community groups, schools, and businesses, and government agencies to make decision-making and governance more democratic. Welcome, Roshan. We are also joined by Petula Jarvis Hanley, who brings more than a decade of experience as a facilitator, coalition builder, and organizer, using dialogue and collective decision-making in partnership with communities. Welcome, Petula. Welcome to you both. All right.
Thanks for having us.
Let's get started with a little bit of a pulse check for everyone who's on the call with us. We're going to drop a question for all of you here in the chat. When you hear dialogue and deliberation, what comes to mind? When you hear dialogue and deliberation, what comes to mind? So please go into the chat, share what comes to mind. Hey, let us know where you're from, where you're joining us from too. Now, while you all are on your way to sharing the wisdom of dialogue and deliberation and what you think comes to mind, let's turn to our panelists. And I'd like to start with you, Petula. When you hear dialogue and deliberation, what immediately comes to mind for you?
Uh, well, conversations and decision making, more specifically, collective decision making is would be what comes to mind when I think of dialogue and deliberation. And of course, as always, after the dialogue and then the collective conversations and discussions to solve an issue, we then have to move toward an action to resolve whatever the issue is collectively.
Thank you. Rashawn, I'm going to turn to you and ask, what comes to mind when you hear dialogue and deliberation?
When I think about dialogue and deliberation, I mean, I've been in that field for over 15 years. I run an organization, help run an organization that has it in the name. So I think of a lot of things in our professional world, and all the experts in this space of helping folks make decisions. But to me, it means uh, listening actually to other people, not just to respond and get your counterpoint in, but to really understand what other people think and where they're coming from. And deliberation to me is about making decisions together, even though we disagree, which is absolutely 100% still possible today. And doing so because we all are actually listening well enough to find space, not to meet in the middle, but find spaces that we can like actually agree on things.
Thank you both. And I agree. This is an interesting opportunity before us. We'll start there with interesting. I think we might end this conversation with it's a wonderful, powerful opportunity before us. But while we are getting started, I'd love to have Jessie, our colleague who's in the ether there, to share what she's seen in the responses from the folks online.
Yes, we're seeing a lot of geographic diversity, which is really exciting. Folks are talking about storytelling, truth telling, deep listening, curiosity, weighing viewpoints and perspectives, people coming together, so collaborative, plus one on coming together to discuss and also move towards solutions. Um, Collective spaces, respect, collective efforts. Yep. Intentional collaboration. A lot of great descriptors here.
Thank you for that, Jesse. And I'm definitely hearing what's being lifted up in um, the importance of being intentional. Um, Folks get together and make decisions all the time. I used to work with young people. They got together and made decisions a lot. Sometimes they weren't the best ones. So it's not just the decision making, right? But it's really being intentional and obviously thoughtful and critical in that decision making process. So great opening. It sounds like folks are warming up. Just want to share quickly from the perspective of everyday democracy. We speak of dialogue as conversations designed to build understanding, connection, and relationships. And we see deliberation are decision-making processes where options are weighed and actions or policies are decided. In this space, we are generally talking about group deliberation, though if you're a parent, you might know that you do a fair amount of deliberation, deliberating with young ones. Uh, so, or if you have young people in your life that you care about. The first thing to know is that dialogue and deliberation are things that we do all the time. We may not call it that. So let's ground our conversation in your experiences with dialogue and deliberation. So I would love to start, Rashawn, with you. If you could share a moment when you realized that dialogue or collaborative decision making could create real change. Tell me about that moment that shifted your thinking.
Yeah, I think one of the earliest experience or aha experiences I had was when I was in undergrad. I went to college at a Big Ten school, and we had a student government that like allegedly had power but didn't do much, and also was kind of both like really focused on the Greek system, kind of to the detriment of everybody else. And I, as an outsider, like just student organizer, had a series of conversations. I started working with some folks on campus were with alternative clubs, ethnic cliques and groups, associations. And we had a series of conversations with the student government leadership that really did not have our issues on their mind. And I can actually remember sitting in this room with a couple of the president and vice president of the student government and a couple like local, we were, part of the Black Student Associations and Arab Muslim Student Association. And I saw these folks, these student government leaders shift over just a long conversation we had in some conference room, shift from thinking this is an annoying and like an annoying effort and not a good use of their time, and they definitely weren't going to agree to this, to starting to see them open up to saying like, wow, this actually could strengthen the way we engage students, and we actually really want to consider this. And that actually led to the creation of like a new slice of the student government. And I think that was one of my earliest kind of ahas, was sitting in that room and watching over the hour these fairly conservative student government leaders shift to being more open to the effort to change.
I love that. The curiosity and the openness, the listening, what you stated in the beginning, listening to understand. Petula, how about you? What was a moment when you realized that dialogue or collaborative decision making could create real change?
So I reflect on, I would say it was 2019 when I had the opportunity to create curriculum, a civic engagement curriculum for a group of 14 and 15-year-olds who were part of the New York City Summer Youth Employment Program. And just being with them for 6 weeks, I learned a lot. And creating that space for dialogue was very important. It was the foundation of building relationships, building trust. And as to Rashawn's point, creating an atmosphere of listening, because students did complain that the adults did not listen to them. And that included parents and teachers and just other adults in community alike. So really intentionally doing the work of dialogue and relationship building without not really knowing how beneficial it would be at the time. And in doing a civic engagement curriculum, a lot of students had a notion about voting, about getting involved in community, and they said, why bother? No one listens to us anyway. And so that encouraged me to think creatively about a project that they could actively participating, be deliberative, make decisions, and not only be present in the room, but also effect change. And so I was able to show them that even though their day-to-day lives, it didn't seem as though the deliberative process was inclusive of them, that it could be. And at the end of the summer youth program, we were able to train students to be speakers and to engage and to meet elected officials and to actually go to City Hall to advocate for more funding for summer youth. And that was something very tangible and something that was won through the Public Advocate's Office. And that was my aha moment, where it's not enough to try to bring students and youth to the table in the decision-making process, but that their stories, their ideas, their solutions, their brainstorming to actually see that tangibly effect change was very powerful for me.
I love that. And you're making me think in both of your responses that there's something about power, access to engage with it, right? The power with others, the collective power, or the power within oneself to see themselves as a leader, are important outcomes of these types of processes when done well. And that's That's really important for people to know because we're going to talk about it done well. But I do want to kind of like start by helping people understand what they don't understand about deliberation. So I'm going to ask you, and I'll start with you, Rashawn. What do people most often misunderstand about deliberation?
Hmm.
What is that? What is it? And what isn't it? Like, so what do people misunderstand about deliberation,
Mhm.
what it is, and what it isn't?
Yeah, I think that the biggest misunderstanding about deliberation that I hear often is that people assume that it is going to involve the kind of pejorative sense of compromise, that we're going to come together with people we disagree with, and we're going to have to like give up something that we care about, and be in the middle in this kind of like reductive, let's just split the difference way. And that's not at all what deliberation is about. Um, and that's not the goal. That's, sometimes that's negotiation between lawyers. But if you are having a deliberation between a group of real people, you shouldn't just be splitting the difference. Uh, what it is coming to an agreement that's actually better than any one side would have come up with on their own. Um, and an example I recently heard that was a really good example of this is in Taiwan. Sometime shortly before or after the pandemic, there was a national debate about what to do about the Uber and Lyft apps coming to the country. There's a well-established taxi sort of sector, and all those people were gonna, we're fighting against these rideshare companies coming in and taking their jobs. And there was basically a proposition to either get rid of the Uber apps, the rideshare apps, just never let them in, or let them all the way in and give them free reign. And the kind of sides were lining up, and the Taiwanese government actually facilitated a series of public deliberations. They had some really cool online tools. You should look into it, that they use to get people engaged digitally. And the outcome was actually to create a special kind of license for drivers that would distinguish them and make space for both taxis and Lyft shares or ride shares. And neither side had been even considering that type of outcome. And but that's what deliberation does. It takes people who are kind of polarized and see themselves as like opposed to the other side, and helps them actually figure out something that is greater than the sum of the parts of just what can we all shake out and agree on as some kind of like common denominator or splitting of the difference. It created a new idea that no one had come up with before, and was only possible because the sides were listening to each other and genuinely considering what the interests the other side had was, and how to make sure that everyone got their needs met. And that's what deliberation is supposed to be.
Yeah, I'm hearing that. And I think one of the things that is quite helpful is probably that people are starting from shared facts or information about um, the value or the benefit, right? Or the challenges of whatever the position or decision is to be made. Because I can imagine you'd have both, right? As it says, the sides lined up. What for you, Petula, does it sound, what would you add to that in terms of thinking about what people misunderstand about deliberation and what you think it is or isn't?
I think I want to share the time frame. And so deliberation is not a quick process. And so anyone coming into a space to try to solve an issue together should know that it takes time, right? There's some things that have to happen before, of course. And what comes to mind is my experience with participatory budgeting, not only as a constituents when I was first exposed to participatory budgeting, but even also working within with the participatory budgeting project. And so deliberation takes time, and I myself have had to sit with my own impatience, right? Because we tend to want to solve things quickly. It's the world that we live in, especially if we live in cities. We want things to happen really fast, especially when we have good intentions. And so it is not a quick process. However, what it is, it's an inclusive process, and it definitely centers the voices of those who have the lived experience with the issues. And so going back to another misconception, just broadly speaking, is that within deliberation, sometimes folks tend to turn to the experts for the solutions, meaning folks who have maybe a degree in urban planning or a degree in economics, when I think that the experts, and definitely those with the lived experience, those who are going through a specific issue. And so it is not quick, and the definition of experts within the process is not generally not necessarily defined traditionally as those who hold a specific degree or work in a specific office. What it is, though, it's definitely a chance to listen, to solve things together, to hear each other out, and to collectively figure out how best to do what's in the best interest of the community at large and not a specific person. And I would try to explain the PB process here, but I know that that process definitely is a definition or a partial definition of what deliberation could look like.
Mm, I love that. And thank you so much, Tula. I asked the team to please drop into the chat a definition of participatory budgeting so that
Thank you.
people would be able to kind of track along with the conversation there. All right. So I'd like to turn really now to deliberation, particularly under pressure. I think we can all agree that our institutions are under pressure, our democratic values are under pressure, our norms are under pressure, and we as individuals being in community with one another are under pressure, right? There's a very specific dynamic that we're all grappling with as we move around and in community with each other. So I'm going to just come at this really hard and fast, well, maybe not fast, but we'll come at this hard. So, Rashawn, this question, right? First, I want you to reflect on why you choose deliberation over walking away or fighting back through other means. Now that's the setup, that's the question. Here's the setup for the question for the audience. Rashawn, you're someone who in the local community that you live in have worked alongside community leaders and police leaders and other government officials as an organizer who wants to abolish policing. And later, you help bring community members into a collaborative process that included police and city officials. So, in the setup, we now know why I've asked the question. For someone who has experienced, direct injustice, violence at the hands of policing in your community, why choose deliberation over walking away or fighting back through other means? I'm going to invite people, if you're familiar with the lady who does the Twilight Zone recaps, I'm going to invite you to lean in to what he says here. Rashawn, you have the floor.
Thanks. I will also lean in. So, yeah, I think it's important to say that to me, I think that abolition looks like policing as an institution as we know it no longer existing. But to be clear, I think it is a positive thing that as a society, we've developed the capacity to respond to something like the Aurora Theater shooting, which happened 20 minutes from where I'm sitting, with prejudice and immediately. I think of abolition as achieving a state where we retain that kind of ability to keep people safe in instances of serious and like urgent emergency violence or emergencies that include violence. Um, but that you would have a function like that work a little bit more like the firefighters, where like firemen, don't go around asking people like, "Hey, you look like you like matches, or do you have any gasoline, and stopping people randomly like that's. But if there is fire, they are there in a flash, and they have all the tools, they have all the training that is needed to put out that fire, or at least contain it and deal with it effectively, rapidly. And then they go back to the firehouse and wait for the next time that they're needed. And I think that to me, abolition would look like policing turning into more of a firehouse model than out in the world, unless they're like investigating a crime that already is like solved, figuring out who did a murder. So I want people to know that that's how I think of abolition, because it hopefully it helps folks hear me better when I say I think we need to fundamentally alter and greatly reduce the institution of policing, um, such that it would be abolished. And I had a really positive, collaborative working relationship with the last 2 and 3 Denver police chiefs. And one of them specifically, I worked with for 2 years to help advocate for and then design and then support the launch of an alternative crisis response mechanism here in Denver. It's now known as STAR, but it is essentially a fourth branch of 911 response, where instead of a cop car, a fire truck, or an ambulance, you get the STAR van. And that van has a crisis mental health clinician and a paramedic on it, where if a 911 call comes in now in Denver for the last 6 years, you can get, if a 911 call comes in and there is a mental health or substance use related emergency, you get that response. So why I chose to work with the police on reducing the presence of police, because that was the goal for us, for me, in working on that STAR program, was to reduce the presence of police in my community and get people who are having mental health crises and other kinds of crises that are not legal. No one needs, a man with a badge and a gun there. They actually need a different kind of help, that they could get that help. And why I chose deliberation was because we could never have done that, gone around the police, or put them out of that. And I think it's just quite often deliberation is more practical and effective. You might be more likely to get your way certainly than just walking away or failing to engage. And if, there's other ways that are just like, you're clearly not going to win, in the kind of Martin Luther King sense of you will be overwhelmed by an opponent's force. So don't take that route, because there's better ways. That to me is a really important reason to engage in deliberation, even when we disagree with people, because we can't change institutions, especially without ever having had a conversation with people in that institution, or even persuading them that our proposal, our position, is one that they should listen to.
And perhaps maybe even find support. I know where I am
Oh yeah.
it was recognized that A lot of positions were being called to emergencies that they weren't able, or to social needs that they weren't able to meet. And so
That's right.
recognize.
That's right.
Um,
Yeah,
I
the police were one of the biggest supporters of the program.
and I think that your point around you must engage with all kinds, right, of partners. Like if you're going to do public dialogue, guess who comes to the dialogue? That would be the public. And the public comes in all of its glory. And we have to be prepared to work with that in the context of dialogue and deliberation. So, Patula, I'm going to turn to you and say, or ask, right? You know, dialogue, deliberation often bring together people um, who are profoundly unequal in the power they hold, and groups who are in active conflict or who have had a history of conflict, whether communal or interpersonal violence. So, if we're talking about a power imbalance and you're in a dialogue or deliberation, what do you say to someone who asks you, why should I deliberate with people who don't believe I deserve equal rights, or at least the same rights as them? How do you respond when people ask you that question? Or how would you as you think about this work?
Yeah, this is a loaded question. For a couple of reasons, because as a person of color, sometimes as a woman of color, as an immigrant, you know, sometimes I myself feel powerless, right? And so sometimes I have the conversation with myself or with my family, why should I even try to have a conversation, much less make decisions together with a particular group or in a particular instance? Um, However, as a community leader, as a woman of faith, as a member of a faith-based institution, Bedford Central Presbyterian Church, who is actively involved in social justice actions, etc., I try to remind folks of a quote that I've heard from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that says, people hate each other because we don't know each other. And we don't know each other because we don't take the time to talk or to have dialogue with each other. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we would agree on everything, but there would be a clearer understanding of the things that we do have in common as individuals, and what we want for our communities sometimes is not very far from of one group from the other. From a faith-based perspective, I would say that we have a moral responsibility to bring folks together to dialogue and to deliberate, even when folks don't believe they have equal rights, because I think that we can remind folks of the power that they hold, especially instances where it has felt like some institutions or some groups have power over versus rather than power with. And I'll give the example. I know it's in historical context, there has been violence between the Jewish community and Black community in Crown Heights. For those who may have heard of the Crown Heights riots decades ago. And even though there has not been violence to that extent, there are things that pop up occasionally within communities, Crown Heights community in Brooklyn, between the Jewish faith and non-Jewish faith Blacks. There was a recent incident, maybe a year and a half ago. And so why should any side come together to dialogue, to deliberate? Because we live in community together. We share the same elected officials. We want what's best for our community and for our families. And so, for those who feel that they don't have the power, this is when, as a faith-based leader, you remind them of their power, not to antagonize, but to come to agreement. And for instances where one group may feel left out or not as protected, for example, we give them the tools to deliberate, to make decisions around, or to help inform decisions around getting the protection that they think they deserve, and to just bring that humanity and that equality and that equity conversation to the table. For example, there is police presence in Crown Heights in one community more than the other. Why is that? And so the folks who don't have that police protection have a right to ask for it because of whatever incidences or data, et cetera, because we all pay taxes. We all have a right to be in community together, and we can only accomplish and we can only accomplish having that equity and that balance and that fair share of resources if we speak out and speak up. And I think just having training in facilitation and multi-partial facilitation is helpful. And I would encourage all leaders, whether faith-based or otherwise, all facilitators to engage and to learn how to better handle conflict and to help to solve issues through deliberation and dialogue.
I love what you said there. First, because you teed up an opportunity for me to share that Everyday Democracy has an incredible multi-partial facilitation training that community organizers and leaders have found particularly useful when dealing with more high conflict challenges in communities. So just sharing that. And then I wanted to really amplify and underscore your drawing on the wisdom of Dr. King, particularly as you're discussing power, right? And we keep talking about how power and people's ability to access it shapes their relationship, not just to each other and to the entities that are supposed to serve them, but to themselves, right? There's dignity in being able to walk down a clean street, right? Or to turn a faucet and have clean water to drink. Your children to be able to travel and ride the neighborhood in bicycles without fear. There's dignity in that. And there's also power in that. So, Dr. King, this quote is a longer piece, but says, what is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting for everything that stands against love. So there we go. All right. I'd like to continue this conversation with the question I think is on everybody's mind. What makes deliberation work? So I'd like to talk about good deliberation, quote unquote, less successful or bad deliberation, and what makes deliberation work under pressure. Again, we cannot have this conversation outside of the context of the current social environment that we're in, and democracy itself is under pressure. Now, we know that diamonds can come from being under pressure, but also we can get crushed along the way. So, Rashawn, I'm turning to you and I'm going to ask you, to share a story from your work where deliberation genuinely changed an outcome. Tell us about what challenges you addressed and what made that process successful.
There's a couple examples I'm deciding between, but I think I'll stick with the story one. But before I go there, I just want to add to the last question that I think that part of what also needs to be said about the question about like, should I deliberate with people who don't believe I have equal rights? I have two answers, which is you shouldn't, maybe, if you feel like if you're actually, being treated unfairly by the process or maybe in danger, but also that like people who don't believe you have equal rights like don't show up to deliberate with you, and that's probably not. That's I feel like this is a boogeyman we kind of like make for ourselves sometimes, and I just want to like state that before we start.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, of course. But yeah, I mean, I think I'll stick with the STAR process, the advocacy that my organization I used to lead. Um, the advocacy we were doing for an alternative response started in 2017. And it took us until 2019 to actually invite city officials and a couple of police officials to come with us to like a site visit to a really amazing program that used to exist in Oregon that we were basically trying to copy and paste into Denver. And when we got back, everyone was sold. They wanted to just get started immediately, including the police chief, who just started convening a working group with community members, care providers, a couple other, agencies that needed to be involved, 911. And it was facilitated by the Department of Safety. And so that meant that the whole conversation was tilted pretty severely. And some of us community participants in the kind of working group that then took another year and some change to design and kind of figure out what the process was to look like. We demanded that we actually get our own facilitator, not that like the cop facilitator go away and we, get to take over the whole process, but that we have a shared dual facilitation of that working group and its community, the emails in between, the agenda setting, and the actual in-person facilitation. We advocated for our own non-law enforcement facilitator, and we got it. And that was important. That ended up making so much and so many differences along the way that it wasn't just the cops setting the agenda and dictating what we're going to talk about this time and sort of saying like, everybody agree? Okay, cool. It really made us slow down and hear each other better, to have kind of two poles of facilitation power in that space. And it made a difference in, like I said, a ton of different ways, but one of the most important ways was there was a moment in like we came back from the site visit in June, and in late October, the police chief opened up one of the first meetings to say, okay, well, I think we're ready to roll and start this response pilot. And the community folks strongly disagreed that we were ready. And having that facilitation that wasn't just the safety department leadership meant that we actually got the safety department to slow its roll and work with us longer to make sure that we had everything clear and that we had achieved some of the sort of guarantees we wanted, and it meant we didn't roll the project out until the following June, which ended up being a critical and positive thing to happen for lots of reasons. But that's one example I would share.
And can you say a little bit more about what, as a community member, what were you experiencing that led the group to say, hey, we think we need not just to expand the conversation or get somebody to think more about X, Y, and Z, but
Hmm.
that we need more representation. Very specifically, I will underscore, you said, though not specifically in these words, power. We need more
Hmm.
power
Yeah,
because you described the in-between meetings and the agenda setting as part of the strategy of how what we deliberate about, what we talk
absolutely.
about. And so, what was it that the community was feeling in that moment? If you could just say in a minute, less than a minute,
Yeah.
what was that? What was the underlying thing that was driving that desire and then
Yeah.
ultimately decision?
Um, it was the discrepancy of power. It felt like showing up, in the first month or two, that it was clearer and clearer that we were sort of invited guests at the table, and not, participants in the conversation. That, the meal, if you were to put it in sense of like a dinner party, like the meal and the choices of drinks, etc., were all being planned before us, but we were being told that, oh, but this is your party, and it definitely wasn't. We were kind of slowly becoming the recipients of updates instead of the participants in, shaping a conversation. And that was because all the, official conversations, lots of people who work in government know that it's the meeting before the meeting and the meeting after the meeting that matter a lot. And we were being cut out of we and our interests were being cut out of, those conversations.
Mhm. And I love the unpacking of that for people who are leading processes in community or with community or in themselves community members, in a process. These are the kinds of things that you want to be thinking about that shape the direction of a deliberation or a dialogue before it even gets started. Petula, you've spoken about the importance of scale and structure in these moments. Can you share a story about how you've designed and led processes for people in high conflict? What we're interested in knowing is what choices mattered most and how did you deal with those in power balance, with those power imbalances?
Um, Thank you, Merle. First, let me acknowledge that sometimes the first hurdle is getting folks in the room to even deliberate dialogue and deliberate. So that is can be challenging. However, sometimes when things are really heated, well, not sometimes, folks want to be heard. They want their side of the story to be shared, and they want to be heard. They want to be understood. And so we've seen moments in history where communities stand in solidarity. But as I shared in my last example with the Crown Heights riots, it's a case where um, you know, there's been fractured relationships within this community. And of course, this has been ongoing and built over time, resource competition, unresolved harm. And so the example that I began to share, the more recent example where there was a issue, a violent issue between a Jew and a Black male in a wheelchair. Uh, I I convened a group of leaders, faith-based leaders especially, but all leaders in community to respond to this conflict. And the intention was to have some accountability, some understanding, to hear everyone out, but also to move towards solutions for peace in the community. Unfortunately, I was not the facilitator for the convening. A more senior person was, and we can talk about power dynamics even within faith-based institutions. But what I observed was that the facilitation was skewed. There was unequal time, there was inconsistent enforcement of the process, and there was no mechanism in place to hold power accountable. Specifically, I can remember one of our violence interrupters, we call them here, uh, wanted to just share for a few minutes, but was shut down. And so, because another person was taking up a lot of time, and what eventually happened is that I said, go ahead, just get up and say it. I was a little instigator at the back. And so he got up and he said his piece and he said, I apologize for interrupting. It was not my turn. I, however, have to go back outside to ensure that nothing jumps off in the community, to ensure that, I need to go do my job to ensure that I can intervene in case anything happens, things like that. And so the young man, even though he explained why he needed to just speak for a minute and then leave, to me was disrespected by both groups, both leaders, both sets of leaders in both groups. And so when we talk about space and structure and scalability, I think we think scaling in terms of bringing people together to deliberate sometimes means scaling up. But in this moment, what I learned was that sometimes you have to scale down. And scaling down helped to provide a little bit more structure. And I know Rashawn had said, and as he shared his story, there's the meeting before the meeting, then the meeting after the meeting. But in this particular instance, bringing together top leaders from each group, from each segment in a smaller meeting, right? It then became easier to hold people accountable, to manage the power dynamics, and then to create conditions where folks could speak honestly without escalation. But that only works if the person who's representing a particular group has the trust of true representation of the group that they are deliberating on behalf of. But at the core of all of this, we were able to move towards, some sense of understanding, right? Because I grew up with a saying, there are three sides to a story, right? Your side, his side, and then the actual truth, right? And so we were able to get towards a place of understanding, a place of, the gentleman in the wheelchair said, I don't want any violence. Let's just talk. Let's just figure this out, and so scaling down actually facilitated a stronger and more equitable deliberative process and manage that power dynamic much better. And then leaders who were representative could then go back to their various groups to then relay back, okay, this is what I said, this is how I represented you, this is the agreement that we came to. I'm not sure if I answered all of the question, Merle.
That was great. That was really great. You have me thinking about mechanisms that are going to be important, right? Instead of bigger or larger, depth, right? Sometimes Adrienne Marie Brown would say, right, small is all, right? The fractal is what's important if you want to get down into the depth of relationship. And it sounds like repair. What does repair look like? It's usually going to come out of a conversation, a connection, right? An agreement that people make about what happened, and what they want to happen next, right? So this is a lot of what happens in dialogue and deliberation, what happened and what happens next. And you have me thinking about Natanya Lee and the principle that she has brought to community of principled struggle, right? This idea of being generative. Very quickly, she said, in struggle that is principled, we struggle for the sake of building deeper unity, that we are honest and direct while holding compassion, that we each take responsibility for our own feelings and actions and seek deeper understanding by asking questions and reading, right? Whatever the text is, before we launch into a counter argument. And so I've heard that summed up in the reflections from Roshan, and as well as you, Petula, as you're thinking about how we show up and how we do deliberation and the stance that we have to take as individuals in that context, whether it's the bravery to extend trust where it hasn't been earned, but it's going to be necessary to even build more trust, or if it's the opportunity to just pause and get folks to reflect and then think in terms of how do we move forward together. So we are going to questions from the audience. But before we do, I am going to ask you, Roshan, what's one practice people, and let's think about this as a lightning round. Um, what's one practice people can start using to strengthen shared decision making where they already have influence? So what's one practice?
Yeah. You can practice, or better yet, get training in facilitation. Being someone who helps others have a conversation together is such a vital service you can provide to any group you're in. As long as you do it well and have an eye toward fairness and sort of making sure everyone is heard. And it can sometimes, you don't have to be a formal facilitator. You can sometimes just be, the person who says like, wait, I think what you said is blah, 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 blah. Did I get that right? So that everyone hears and so that that person gets a chance to, make sure that they were understood. You don't have to be a facilitator to just pop up and say, I like what you said, but let me make sure I'm getting it. You don't have to, you can do that in any conversation and you're helping people hear each other better. And especially if there's a decision to be made, it's coming from that conversation, that kind of playing that kind of role, whether on the subtle level or in a kind of more like formal way, can make a huge difference in making sure that the decision is the best one, because you're helping people slow it down, make sure that we're accounting for everything before we go forward, or like call for the vote. That's one thing you can do.
No, I really appreciate that reflection and the importance. Petula, as we're getting and teeing up our Q&A, what's one decision in a community, workplace, congregation, school, or organization? So all the places that people could make with one another instead of for one another. So, what's one decision that can be made within these spaces in our lives, community, workplace, so on and so forth, that people can make with one another instead of making for another?
That is easy. How to spend the money. So participatory budgeting. Participatory budgeting is just not only how to spend public money, it can be practiced within institutions, within organizations, within places of work, where everyone who is involved has a say or an input in how the budget is spent. There is school participatory budgeting, and so sometimes you have school districts who would put aside a certain percentage of their budget and have students actually run a project to decide collectively, not only with students and teachers, but even the surrounding community, how we could spend the money in the best way that, we need as a student body, as a student community. One example is students in Arizona decided that they wanted to do something not just for their school, but that the community could benefit from. And so they voted and built a project around a bus stop, right? With shades and some really cool artistic designs and water fountains, so that it wasn't just for them, but also for folks in the community, coming to work at the school, or, just as that stop, uh, to just foster that sense of belonging, that sense of care, that sense of trust. So in any setting, schools, churches, government, private workplace, there is money to be spent, and sometimes a good way to spend the money and to budget effectively would be to get everyone's input in a deliberative process.
Agreed. I mean, I think what I'm hearing you all say um, is that it's important to engage the community and to engage these processes, but people need to be prepared to engage with these processes as well. Or one might want to ensure that we scaffold the experience. I'm talking teacher talk now. Scaffold, right? So provide the building blocks along the way of engagement. I think that's probably true of how we go about doing dialogue and deliberation, right? We build the capacity for folks to be able to sit and hear differing thoughts, ideas, opinions, attitudes from our own, right? And manage our nervous systems. Because I'd love to talk about this. What what is the role as facilitators of these kinds of community processes? And again, the public comes to public things. That's I like to say. And as a result, people come with all the things that they come with. And so my curiosity with you all is, how do you think about your deliberative processes or dialogue processes from the perspective of managing nervous systems, right? And the ways in which our practice at Everyday Democracy includes a trauma-informed lens and approach to facilitation. And so I'm thinking we're walking a lot or moving a lot from trigger to trigger. There's a lot of traumatized people moving and trying to simultaneously survive really horrible, social conditions, economic conditions, while trying to change those conditions, right? A lot of communities find themselves simultaneously trying to survive and build new systems at the same time, and that um, takes a tremendous toll on the body, on the spirit. And so I'm curious from you all's perspective, whoever wants to hop in here, how do you think about the fact that people do arrive in varying states of readiness for the openness and engagement? Then we're going to talk about direct conflict. So tee up some stories because, yeah, I'm sure people are thinking about that too. But let's think about nervous systems, how we support people in their trajectory to be able to be in conversation with people that are holding views that they personally are challenged by for whatever reason. Who wants to pitch in that one?
Oh, sure. Thank you, Rashawn. I think designing the space for equity, for inclusion, for accessibility, and it will never be 100% perfect, but putting some thought into, well, at least an in-person space. Something as simple as providing refreshments. In my community, almost every meeting, whether faith-based or community meetings, we try to provide a light snacks or even dinner if funding allows, because like you said, folks are traumatized and they have a lot to deal with. Some folks have whether economic justice issues and just struggling to survive, but want to be a part of real change. And something as simple as providing transportation, providing meals, if possible, for folks to then be able to at least not have to worry about those two things, is one way that it's not a part of the actual facilitation, but it's a part of the space design to ensure that particular meeting, et cetera, is doesn't increase the trauma of the participants. And in terms of facilitation, I think just laying that groundwork, because people want to be heard. And so just creating that understanding that we're going to create that space and that we're going to, and just having those community agreements ahead of time, and practice some intentional facilitation so that folks can be heard. And another possibility, and not necessarily in a meeting space, but in a more public open space, is also ensuring that you provide resources. You can't preempt everything. You don't know everyone's need or what they're managing or coping with. But I remember actually facilitating a meeting with the Brooklyn NAACP president. We're talking about voting and the power of five. And somehow out of that meeting came a story of someone sharing a really traumatic experience. And I wish I had a mental health specialist, just with me at that meeting. So you can't preempt everything, and you can't plan for everything, but you can learn from experience and try as much as possible to facilitate with intention.
I love that. Rashawn, do you have some thoughts on this? I definitely do.
It's funny, Patul actually took the two that I was going to share. Was like, food is actually one of the best things you can do to help people regulate. It activates your parasympathetic nervous system, like your body rests and digests. And I even heard it said that, if you're having a panic attack, put a piece of gum in your mouth and chew, even if you're not eating, because the act of chewing immediately activates that like calming side of your nervous system. And then I was going to say that an important part of I know people who start their meetings with like, let's everybody take a deep breath together, and there's some settings where just that feels weird or even contrived. But being able to just give people the agenda ahead of time, and or saying it at the beginning so that everyone knows we're gonna go from here to there to there, is actually this I think underappreciated way of helping people regulate during a meeting. Because if they know that there's a part that they're nervous about, or that they've got big opinions on, that they can just kind of know, okay, I know it's coming after these two things. That's a key piece. But I also think that, quite often, as a facilitator, you can just kind of notice when someone is agitated or really kind of getting turned up and really wants to say something, or they keep trying to jump in about that thing. And quite often, the easiest thing you can do to deal with people who are kind of disruptive is to give them make them feel heard. And sometimes that can just be acknowledging out loud, hey, it looks like you really are invested in this topic of conversation. I would love to hear your thought or your question, but then we got to keep it moving and go to someone else. Being able to just say a couple of things without a rant is good, but also, God, when you have co-facilitator, like offering someone one-on-one time with, your co-facilitator so they can just really unload on that person and all of us can keep moving, is that's a way to deal with people who are quite often having kind of like a nervous anxiety, like sometimes it's related to trauma, like kind of response to a conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate that. Well, always community values and appreciates meeting material needs, right? It signals to people, right? I value your time and participation enough to provide care. Care is a really important, I think, aspect of trying to do this work of dialogue and deliberation in community. I'm thinking a lot about and appreciate, Rashawn, that you mentioned, it's a good idea to be in pairs, right? So that folks can tag team things. Some things I like to maybe suggest to folks, if you should know or have an idea of who you think is going to show up to your events, right? And be prepared to meet the specific needs of who those folks are. Um, in previous lifetimes, we've had things like care captains. So folks whose job it is, who volunteer, who usually are mental health providers in community or care providers in community in some way, volunteer to be care captains for community as things emerge. There's the opportunity to start out by ensuring that things are available in languages that people feel comfortable with, and that people are available that speak languages that people feel comfortable with. And that if you are going to do an event in a community that is, more heavily you know focused in language skills around home languages as opposed to maybe English. If you're trying to work with communities that do not speak English primarily, or do not want to have their interactions or information received that way, then you need to provide translation, right, of materials, of services, real-time translation services. So there's all kinds of ways that we can show up with people. Language, disability justice strategies are a huge part of that, right? So you don't know who's going to show up, but you could ask and make sure that you had the necessary interpreters that folks needed, or sign like folks. And so it's important to have a sense of who's in the room and who you're inviting to the room when you're doing work with community. Okay, so I asked. So I'm gonna ask this question. Um, Rashawn, how do you address when people are refusing to participate in a dialogue and deliberative process in good faith?
Um, I need a little more specificity. Do you mean when they have shown up to the process, but they are coming from yeah, I mean, there's several different ways. I mean, I would use different strategies based on in what the lack of good faith was showing up as, because there's a lot of ways people can be deceptive or intentionally disruptive. So it depends. Um, if it's happening live during the meeting or the process or whatever stage of the process, and it's like disruptive enough at that moment, um, if I'm the person who's facilitating or in charge of the process in some way, um, I think that it's useful to find a way to call for a break and like pull that person aside. Um, but often this is why before like long processes, like if you're just gonna have one meeting or one conversation, I'm not sure that ground rules are like really critical. Um, if you just kind of establish like we're gonna treat each other with respect in this space. But if you're in a, multi-part, like longer term deliberative process, I think it is important to have a sort of set of understandings and commitments that the participants are invited to make and hold each other to, and to genuinely like get it locked in to the point where they all do in fact agree. Because then when someone starts showing up in a disruptive way, a way that they're clearly not, trying to succeed here, um, it's really useful to have established ground rules, norms, whatever you call them, because then it's kind of becomes this like sign that you can just kind of point to the sign, say like, hey, remember you said you were going to do that. Like, is there something you need to be able to get back to what the sign says? Um, it is often about, the strategy that I apply is often about trying to figure out like what does this person want or need, that would make them or support them participating in a better way than they are right now. Um, and I'll usually try to do that in private so you don't like shame people. But then I'm super not above shaming people. Just kind of calling people out in the meeting. If it's I pulled you aside in the last break and told you what the problem is, or asked you what the problem is. You said you were fine. I'll just kind of pull it right back out on them and say like, hey, we talked about this earlier, and you said you weren't gonna do this again. Um, if we can't straighten this out, like we're gonna have to pause for the day, and you might not be able to like keep going. Which means that your interests won't be represented, and you're not gonna get hurt. And so I hope we can kind of shift this. That is a real thing I would say live in a meeting if it's been like a constant repeat offender type thing. But usually it is seeking to understand, help someone feel heard, help someone feel seen, and do it in private at first, and kind of help them just know like I'm watching you. Kind of like the way that your schoolroom teacher would just come sit next to the stand near the kids who are like talking in the back. There's a bunch of different strategies, but helping people feel seen, heard, understand that their needs are like going to be accounted for, respected, is usually quite enough. And like I said, like if you've got earnest processes, people who, seek to thwart the process, I think that very few people who are, facilitating in their everyday life, or even on kind of like low stakes community stuff, you're rarely going to have people show up actively trying to sabotage your whole thing. So I don't think that that's a serious concern that people should like have that makes you scared off from trying this sort of thing.
Yeah, I agree with all of the suggestions that you made. I would invite us to consider that it might not even be malicious. Um, it could be just habit. There are um, certain ways that folks show up to participate that are rooted very much in their experiences of power, privilege, and oppression, right? And all of us hold all three of those things at any given moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes it might not even be malicious per se, but it's still equally derailing to the
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah, and I want to underline that to say that like yes, it's kind of easy for us to like imagine the 50-year-old business leader white guy who like just can't never raises his hand, just jumps in whenever he wants, like, and talks over people. But it is also like I just want to say that like we're not talking down to folks when we say it's like important to build the skills and kind of like get a foundation for this, because even outside of those kinds of factors, we're never really taught to participate in effective community conversations that are equitable or deliberative in almost any space in America. Like, schools are a dictatorship from the perspective of the student. And if you have, any space where you've had quality, we're all listening to each other type conversations, it's probably not the norm for you and your life. And it's definitely not the norm for everyone. And like, where would you learn these skills sometimes is my question. And that's why I think it's important for folks to take seriously that it is dialogue and deliberation are skills. And the people who work in this space are professionals whose skills value or matter and are worth a lot because we don't it's not every day you come across someone who is a great listener and can jump in and direct a whole group of people confidently and effectively. Like that stuff doesn't just we're not raised like that in this country.
So then does that become a benevolent dictatorship? I don't know.
Absolutely. Some of my, like when a board hires me to help them like figure out their strategic plan, like they want me to stop them from going sideways. And so yes, sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. Fair is fair. Yeah. But all in fact, in my experience, true, and really does link to the previous question about what is the responsibility of the facilitator or convener to have a set of tools within their toolkit with which to lead people. The worst thing that can happen is that you lead people to hell. They will never come back to a process. They will never, they're like, no, because they trusted you, right, um, with their opinions, with their spirit, right, their desire, their hopes, their aspirations. And so it's super important, right? So, Petula, I'm going to come to you and I'm going to ask you this question. And that is, how do you respond to people who I'm sorry. How would you, or what advice would you give when trying to facilitate a dialogue in a deeply polarized community? I feel like you should know a little something about this. I know in our pre-conversations I had shared with you, I was in New York at the time when what is called the Crown Heights riots occurred. And so um, the community has been grappling for a long time with these tensions and having to like live and be together. So, yeah, what advice would you give if you're trying to facilitate in a deeply polarized community?
Have a co-facilitator, number one. There are benefits to co-facilitation, which I actually learned during my training at Everyday Democracy. So thank you. Because having a co-facilitator gives you a broader bandwidth to manage power, identify issues, fact check. It gives you a set of tools to manage the facilitation in a very tense environment much better. I think the other advice I would give around facilitation in deeply tense issues, besides having a co-facilitator, would be to, and I just lost my train of thought. It's going to come back in 2 seconds. So co-facilitation and I'm thinking of a meeting I facilitated, and I'm just losing my train of thought right there. Right. So the other most important thing, and I think Rashawn mentioned this, is creating a set of values and norms at the beginning, right? This is what we honor to do together, right? Even though we have different opinions and views, values, cultural differences, in this particular space, this is the set of norms we are going to abide by. So then we can refer back to those norms when things can become tense or out of hand, or if we feel like emotions and tensions are escalating. The other value of having a co-facilitator is actually being able to have a physical person be to then go speak to someone who may seem extremely, you know, anxious, right? Because they could be anxious or they could be aggressive. And so the meeting can continue with one facilitator while the other facilitator could then, pull that other person aside to actually talk to them and maybe help to calm them down, or just to, help them process what they are anxious, or just feel really deep tension about discussing.
Yeah.
And always call out the power dynamic. It may be uncomfortable, but name it. Name it and address it when it happens.
Yes. Deeply appreciate that acknowledgement, because people see it, right? They're not alone in that space. I had a thought too, but the menopause grabbed it. So moving on. Um, thank you. Thank you so much to our incredible panelists, for your insights, and to all of you. Thank you for being a part of this conversation today. As you know, at Everyday Democracy, we believe dialogue is just the beginning. What matters is how we carry it forward into action, into relationship, and into communities that we are a part of every day. So, what can we do next? Here's a few things that we'd like for you to consider as we leave this conversation. So, start one conversation. Reach out to someone you've been avoiding or someone with a different perspective, and practice listening with curiosity, right? So you don't have to convince anybody. You're just listening with curiosity. Share one decision. Share one decision in any group you are a part of, instead of making the next decision yourself. Invite others to help shape it. It can be with your partner, your family, at work, somewhere in the community. No decision is too small. We have to practice our way into being. We practice to become what we are. But we are what we're practicing too. But that's neither here nor there. Messes up the vibe. Build your skills. Learn how to facilitate dialogue and deliberation in your community through Everyday Democracy's multi-partial facilitation training, and explore some of the additional resources available at NCDD. We will follow up today's conversation with a recording, along with these action ideas, additional resources, and ways to stay connected to our speakers. As a reminder, Everyday Democracy partners with individuals, grassroots groups, institutions to build a more equitable, connected, and democratic community. And we'd love to work with you. This has been the 7th conversation in our Doing Democracy virtual series. And we hope you will continue to join us throughout the rest of this year. So let's keep imagining, let's keep doing democracy every day. Thank you, and take good care.
Thanks, everyone.